military mobility. Summer 1939. Caught up in his visions of world domination, Hitler adopts even more aggressive policies. As early as the beginning of April, the Führer had instructed the Wehrmacht High Command to make all preparations for an attack on Poland. The start of the operation, known under the code name Weiß or White, was set for the 25th of August. While Hitler was cancelling a non-aggression pact with Poland and the Anglo-German Fleet Agreement, which had been signed a few years previously, he was playing down his verbal attacks on his real opponent, the Soviet Union. The German Reich and the Soviet Union suddenly sign a non-aggression agreement. In a secret clause, Hitler and Stalin agreed to divide up Poland. This contract then gave Hitler the necessary backing to start his onslaught on Poland. The army moved up into its initial positions. 2 million Germans were under arms, and the Wehrmacht was poised to march into Poland. Hitler was convinced that the British guarantee declaration to Poland was nothing more than a threat. It proved to be a mistake. This time, the stakes were too high, and the Western powers were no longer willing to stand on the sidelines. Europe was poised on the verge of a catastrophe. People held their breaths. The euphoria about going to war was in no way apparent, not like at the start of the First World War. The morning of the 1st of September 1939 saw Hitler begin his war. Some sources say he slept late that day. His forces had pushed deep into Polish territory before he woke up. For the first time, the tanks proved their tactical capabilities. German units quickly smashed their way through various sectors of the front, deep into the Polish lines of defense, and cut them off. The Poles had nothing to counter the cooperation between the German Luftwaffe and the armored units. Polish cavalry. German units pushing from the north and the south finally meet south of Warsaw on the 17th of September. It's all over. The Polish capital was encircled and capitulated on the 28th of September. A few days previously, Red Army units had invaded Poland from the east. Officially, they were there to protect Ukrainians and White Russians resident in Poland under the terms of the secret agreement. The two dictators divided up the spoils. German victory had been achieved by the speedy armored units. For the first time in the history of war, tanks had not only won a battle, but were victorious in an entire military campaign. England and France declare war on Germany on the 3rd of September. But nothing happens in the beginning. Direct military support for Poland was out of the question, and a possible successful attack on Germany's western borders, where the German forces were weakest, did not take place either. War was not declared on the second aggressor, the Soviet Union, either. As the thunder of weapons of war in Europe dies away, a period of calm sets in. It appears as if Europe is again gathering strength for the coming hostilities. Losses were high on both sides. Mothers and fathers, bathed in tears, buried their sons. Wives buried their husbands. Children their fathers. The people in Germany were hoping that the war was over, but Hitler had already planned his next campaigns. Although the German tank units had contributed a great deal to the overall success, the heavy losses and subsequent problems could not be overlooked. Although the Polish army only had 600 mainly outdated armored vehicles and the skies had been dominated by the Luftwaffe, the final balance had a sobering effect. For instance, No. 7 Tank Regiment lost a large portion of its vehicles within a few hours in the battle around Lava. The same can be said in the battle for Warsaw. The Poles were often so superior in street fighting that they forced the German tanks to pull back. Although a large number of damaged tanks could be repaired, the final figure for losses on the German side was around 230 vehicles. Above all, it was the Panzer I and II models which were knocked out in large numbers. Type 3 models and a few Panzer IVs which were there were hardly affected. The Panzer IV, the development of which was started in 1934, had a bigger gun and 2 additional rollers for the tracks. It really managed to prove its worth. 8,000 of them in 10 different versions were produced by the end of the war. Up until 1942, all Panzer IV models were fitted with a short 7.5 centimeter gun. Because this proved to be ineffective against the heavily armored Russian tanks, a long 7.5 centimeter gun was fitted. In spite of a whole range of new developments, the Panzer IV remained the standard tank for the German army up until the end of the war. Its well-tried and tested chassis was used for a number of specialized vehicles, such as the Mark IV tank destroyer, the Hornet, the Wasp, the Rhinoceros, the Bee, and the Mark IV self-propelled gun. Seen in a tactical light, the Polish campaign confirmed Guderian's theories. He had clearly shown that armored units were capable of staging independent operations over long distances to cut swathes in the enemy defenses, which were later occupied by the infantry. The completion of the invasion of Poland saw servicemen from armored units being asked to fill in detailed questionnaires about their combat experience during attacks on bunkers, on flat ground, and in towns and cities. They were asked to make suggestions as far as equipment and tactics were concerned. This data was later used to restructure the German armored units, which was completed in May 1940. The changes included putting all the units which had been under the control of the High Command under the direct control of the tank divisions. The high rate of loss experienced using the Panzer I meant replacing them as soon as possible with more modern vehicles. It was a task that ran into quite a number of difficulties. Spring 1940 saw the Panzer III and Panzer IV models, around 600 in all, only representing slightly less than 20% of the entire total of tanks available, which was 3,300. Further knowledge gained during the Polish invasion centered on the white cross painted on the front of German tanks. It was said to be an ideal target for enemy gunners. The order was given to move it to the turret and line it in black on the inside. Although Hitler's overall tactical thinking recognized that a conflict with the Soviet Union could hardly be avoided, the Reich's relationship with Moscow had improved following the Non-Aggression Pact and an economic agreement. Raw materials from Russia were shipped by rail to the new borders between the two countries to cover credits worth 200 million Reichsmarks granted by Berlin. The goods had to be unloaded and loaded again onto German goods trains because of differing gauges. Fighting Denmark and Norway. The mountainous and often difficult landscape in Norway didn't favor the use of tanks. The main brunt of the fighting rested on the infantry, supported by 100 light Type 1 and Type 2 vehicles. Although the military importance of armored vehicles was small in this case, the more important the knowledge gained about deployment in snowy, swampy, or other difficult areas. It all led to more interest in the building and maintenance of military roads and produced more cooperation between pioneer and armored units. It was something to be of supreme importance during the Russian campaign. While Hitler was working on a campaign in the West, his later opponent, Stalin, was testing the force behind the Soviet war machine with the occupation of Finland. It was only after bitter resistance, which meant high losses for the Red Army, did the Finns finally capitulate in the face of far greater Soviet forces. Actually, this was not the first test of Soviet fighting units. Japanese and Soviet troops stood face to face across a 3,000-kilometer-long border following the Japanese occupation of Manchuria in 1937. Both sides continually tried to move over onto their opponent's territory. Later, a large-scale battle was fought in the Mongolian desert in which Marshal Georgy Zhukov was able to test the newly developed Soviet tanks. Knowledge gained here was later to prove useful when the Red Army came up against the Wehrmacht. Type 1 and Type 2 vehicles, it proved to be the decisive element. All told, the German side had 2,570 armored vehicles, which included 450 Czech tanks which had been captured. 7 out of a total of 10 tank divisions were put under the command of Army Group A. The 3rd and 4th tank divisions took over the task of protecting the right flank in the main area of Belgium, and the 9th Division set off in the direction of Holland. The aim of the operation, known as Scythe Cut, and the massive deployment of armored units, was to quickly make a breakthrough to the Channel coast and separate the Allied troops in Belgium. The plan, which was worked out by the Chief of Staff of Army Group B, Erich von Manstein, was rejected by the Wehrmacht High Command, but accepted by Hitler. Belgium and Holland were quickly overrun. Their capitulation saw the beginning of the West Offensive Stage 2. This was the battle for France. This campaign wasn't easy for the German forces. The Western Allies put up a strong defense. It was the artillery fire that the Germans feared the most. The 37 SA APX 47mm anti-tank gun could smash through the 30mm front armor plating of a Panzer III from a distance of 1,500 meters. The numbers of Anglo-French tanks was around 4,800, and twice as many as on the German side. Armor plating and guns, as well as the 32-ton B-1 tank and the medium-sized Samur tank, were superior to the German models. The turret of the Samur was a one-piece casting and could withstand even direct hits. But it was other factors which brought victory in the campaign. The German armored units came out best because they launched massive attacks and the crews had better training and leadership. Their opponents still considered armor as something to accompany the infantry. Because the tanks had to keep pace with marching troops, they were robbed of their advantage of speed. It was a bad decision that was decisive in the war. Hitler, on the other hand, had pinned his hopes on fast tank divisions and the deployment of the Luftwaffe. Success later proved him to be right. For instance, Major General Erwin Rommel, heading the 7th Tank Division, managed to cover over 300 kilometers in one day in the thrust in the direction of Cherbourg. Although contacts to the German front line were broken, operations of this kind were the basis of victory. According to one French general, it had worried him to find ghostly tanks from the 7th Division moving in various sectors of the front. It later led to the 7th being nicknamed the Ghost Division. Rommel's tactics were successful but risky. For instance, on the 16th of May, his division covered 120 kilometers in one night, beat the surprised opponents, took thousands of prisoners, and captured 100 enemy armored vehicles. A few days later, Rommel had to save his tank from a superior enemy force and drove about an hour with one officer in the middle of a French tank unit without being recognized. He later made good his escape. The forward advance of the German armored columns was so fast that Hitler began to think it was all a tactical plan by the Allies so that they could use reserve forces to attack on the extended German flank. Decidedly nervous, he ordered the tank's spearhead to make a stop and wait for the infantry to catch up. When General von Kleist later stopped Guderian's advance, causing him to offer his resignation, the supreme commander of the 12th Army, General List, intervened. He allowed Guderian to carry out battle reconnaissance, and he then drove his speedy units forward again in the direction of the Channel coast. Guderian always stuck to his motto, "Leadership is from the front," and that is where he always was. It was his way of reacting swiftly to new developments and deploying his tanks in an optimal way. Guderian's tactics was soon adopted by other armored unit commanders. It was successful. A few days later, in the night from the 20th to the 21st of May, and 10 days after the beginning of the campaign, a battalion belonging to the 2nd Panzer Division became the first German unit to reach the coast. As all this was, victory in the West had its horrendous price. Germany had more than 100,000 wounded men and 45,000 dead. These figures underlined how well Hitler's opponents had defended their positions. The majority of German troops or things could be bought here that were impossible to get in Germany. As staff officers got organized and soldiers began to enjoy the sunshine in the numerous street cafes, Hitler was working on his real aim, the end of his main opponent in the East. The war against Britain continued, but apart from occasional bombardments of German and British cities, the weapons remained silent. There was talk of a phony war. Enough people had been killed, and people now wanted to live again. They gladly believed Hitler's talk of peace. In the meantime, the German military was drawing up a balance. There had been 35% losses by tank units. This was less than the percentage on the Allied side, but here were figures that could not be ignored. One reaction was to increase the armor plating on the 2, 3, and 4 tanks to 60 millimeters. Fitting of bigger guns was aimed at improving firepower, and track suspension improvements would help the operating range. New, large-caliber ammunition should help the number of hits. Although the number of German tank divisions was doubled between June 1940 and July 1941, production could still not keep pace with the ambitious plans. In 1940, a total of 895 Panzer IIIs and 280 Panzer IVs left the factories. Following the defeat of the German Luftwaffe in the air in the Battle of Britain, a fact that almost went unnoticed by the German public, Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of England, was cancelled. The Italian offensive against Greece, which Hitler considered stupid from the start, had run into trouble. British advances even meant the danger of Royal Air Force planes stationed in Greece being able to hit the oil fields in Romania, which was so important for Germany. German troops moved into Bulgaria after agreement with the government there and took up positions along the Bulgarian border with Greece. German military preparations at this time centered only on Greece. Berlin had a neutrality agreement with Yugoslavia. As the German-friendly Yugoslav government was overthrown in a coup on the 27th of March and anti-German sentiments were expressed, Hitler called a meeting of his top chiefs of staff and state in the Reich's Chancellery and announced his intention of smashing Yugoslavia. The campaign for Greece, which had been planned for the 1st of April, was postponed for a few days. This meant preparations for the Yugoslavia incursion could be completed and attacks on both countries could be staged simultaneously. The 6th of April saw the German army with 10 tank divisions cross the frontiers. Now was the time to utilize the experience gained in Norway. In spite of all the difficult terrain in the mountainous areas of the Balkans, the German tank units were able to support the Wehrmacht's advance so well that the campaigns could be brought to an end by the end of April. With slightly more than 50 breakdowns, the German tank divisions ended